Have you ever wondered what happens when a man carries an entire empire's secrets locked inside his mind? When every path through the burning sands, every hidden oasis, every safe passage across hundreds of miles of unforgiving desert becomes a weapon waiting to be unleashed. Tonight I want to share with you something that few historians dare to speak about openly. A story buried beneath the shifting dunes of the Sahara, erased from official records, whispered only in certain villages along the ancient trade routes that once connected Darfur to Egypt. This is not fiction. This happened. And the man at the center of it all carried no sword, commanded no army, wore chains for most of his life. Yet he brought an entire network of human traffickers to their knees, using nothing but what he kept locked between his ears. His name was Kofi Mensah, and by the time you finish hearing what I'm about to tell you, you will never think about memory, about resistance, about the human spirit, the same way again. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because what we uncover on this channel goes far beyond what textbooks ever taught you. And if this story moves you the way it moved me when I first discovered it, leave a like so more people can learn what this man achieved against impossible odds. Now settle in, because the desert holds its secrets close. And tonight, we're going to pry them loose. The ruins still stand today, if you know where to look. Scattered across the caravan trails between Darfur and the Nile Valley, there are stones that no longer belong to any structure, wells that have been sealed shut for generations, and stretches of sand where nothing grows, where even the desert wanderers refuse to make camp after nightfall. The zaribas of 1839 have collapsed into the earth. What were once fortified trading posts, bristling with armed guards and packed with human cargo, now exist only as faint depressions in the landscape, visible only from certain angles when the setting sun casts its long shadows across the dunes. Local Bedouin tribes call these places the graves of the greedy ones. Children are warned never to play near them. Old women spit when they pass by. But if you crouch low enough, if you sift through the sand with patient hands, you might still find things. Shackle links corroded green by time. Fragments of water gourds with strange markings scratched into their surfaces. And occasionally, when the wind has blown hard enough to strip away centuries of accumulated dust, you might uncover blackened circles in the earth, where fires once burned so hot, they fused the sand into glass. The official records from the Ottoman administration in Khartoum make no mention of what happened here in the dry season of 1839. The British consular reports from that period focus on trade negotiations and diplomatic maneuvers. The Egyptian authorities, who technically controlled this territory, were far too preoccupied with their own internal struggles to investigate the mysterious collapse of several prominent slave trading operations along the western routes. But the silence in the archives speaks louder than any document ever could. Something happened in the summer of 1839 that changed the desert forever. Something that began with a single man who never learned to read or write, who spent 17 years of his life in bondage, who walked more miles in chains than most people travel in their entire lives. A man whose only weapon was the extraordinary machine that worked tirelessly behind his dark, watchful eyes. His masters called him the walking map. They praised his ability to navigate featureless expanses of sand where even experienced guides lost their way. They marveled at how he could find water where none should exist, how he could predict sandstorms days in advance, how he remembered every rock formation, every dried riverbed, every subtle shift in terrain across thousands of square miles of hostile wilderness. What they never understood, what they could never have suspected, was that every time they forced him to guide their caravans loaded with stolen humanity, every time they made him witness their cruelties, every time they demonstrated just how dispensable human life was in their calculus of profit, they were feeding information into a mind that forgot nothing. And one day, that mind decided to use everything it had gathered against the very system that had created it. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The caravan routes of 19th century Sudan stretched like veins across a body of sand and stone, carrying the lifeblood of an economy built on human misery. From the western reaches of Darfur, where raiding parties descended on peaceful villages in the dead of night, to the markets of Khartoum and beyond to the Egyptian port cities, These paths represented generations of accumulated knowledge about how to move across the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, the 40 Days Road. The name itself contains a promise and a threat. 40 days of walking across open desert, following routes that had been established centuries before the first Arab traders arrived, paths that predated Islam itself, trails worn into the earth by the feet of millions who had no choice but to walk them. At its peak, this network moved between 15 and 20,000 enslaved people per year through a series of way stations called zaribas. These were not simple rest stops. They were fortified compounds, surrounded by thorny barriers made from acacia branches, guarded by armed men loyal to the traders who had invested fortunes in this infrastructure of suffering. The largest zariba in the western reaches belonged to a man named Ibrahim al-Rashid. His compound sprawled across nearly 2 acres of hard-packed earth, surrounded by walls 12 feet high, bristling with wooden spikes along the top. Inside those walls, he maintained separate enclosures for different categories of human merchandise. Women were kept apart from men. Children occupied their own section, watched over by older female captives who had been in the system long enough to understand that cooperation extended their lives. The smell of such a place cannot be described in words that do justice to reality. Hundreds of bodies pressed together under the Sudanese sun, with sanitation consisting of trenches dug along the outer walls, with water rationed so carefully that captives learned to lick the morning dew from their own skin, with disease spreading through the packed enclosures like fire through dry grass. But Ibrahim al-Rashid considered himself a businessman, not a monster. He maintained careful records. He employed physicians of a sort to keep his inventory alive long enough to reach market. He calculated the precise minimum of food and water required to keep a human being walking day after day under the desert sun. He had reduced cruelty to a science, optimized suffering for maximum profit. His compound employed 47 armed guards during peak season. He kept a stable of 12 camels specifically for messenger services, maintaining communication with his network of contacts in Khartoum, in Aswan, in Cairo itself. He owned interests in 3 other zaribas along the northern route, each managed by relatives he trusted to maintain his standards of efficiency. And he owned, among hundreds of other human beings whose names he never bothered to learn, a man in his late 30s who answered to the name his captors had given him 17 years earlier. A man who had been purchased originally for his apparent strength and health, who had survived the initial march from his homeland in the coastal forests far to the west, who had proven himself useful in ways that no one could have anticipated. The hierarchy within the Zariba reflected the hierarchy of the broader society, but with its own brutal variations. At the top stood Ibrahim al-Rashid himself, whose word was law within those acacia walls, whose decisions about life and death were absolute and unappealable. Below him served his trusted lieutenants, mostly relatives by blood or marriage, men who had proven their loyalty through years of shared enterprise in the trade. The guards occupied the next tier, armed men recruited from various tribes, united only by their willingness to participate in the systematic dehumanization that the trade required. They were paid in a combination of currency and privilege, allowed first access to the water supplies, given their pick of the better food, permitted certain liberties with the human property that their employer would overlook as long as it didn't damage the merchandise beyond acceptable limits. Below them came the specialized workers, the cooks who prepared the thin gruel that kept the captives alive, the handlers who managed the movement of people in and out of the enclosures, the breakers whose job was to eliminate any remaining spirit of resistance in newly captured individuals before they joined the main population, the physicians who patched up injuries and treated diseases that might reduce a captive's value at market. And somewhere in this structure, occupying a position that defied easy categorization, worked the guides, men who knew the desert, who could read the stars and the sand, who carried in their heads the accumulated knowledge that made the entire enterprise possible. Kofi Mensah had become the most valuable guide in Ibrahim al-Rashid's operation, not through any choice of his own, not because he sought advancement within a system that had stolen everything from him, but because the alternative was death, and because some part of him, some stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished, had decided that survival itself was a form of resistance. He remembered the day Ibrahim al-Rashid had discovered his gift. It was the 3rd year of his captivity, during a crossing of the northern route. The lead guide, an old man named Yusuf, who had been navigating these paths for 40 years, had collapsed from heat exhaustion. The caravan of 93 captives was stranded in open desert, 3 days from the nearest water source, with provisions calculated precisely for a journey that now threatened to extend beyond their capacity. The guards had panicked. The other captives had begun to wail, certain that they would all die together in this wasteland. Ibrahim al-Rashid, who was accompanying this particular shipment because it included several high-value captives destined for a wealthy buyer in Cairo, had stood in the center of the chaos, calculating losses, considering whether to abandon the weaker members of the group to lighten the load and extend the remaining supplies. And then the young man with the quiet eyes had spoken up. In halting Arabic, learned over 3 years of listening to his captors, he had described an alternative route. A detour that would add only half a day to their journey, but would take them past a seep spring that existed in a particular rock formation, a spring that the old maps didn't show, that Yusuf himself had never discovered, but that Kofi had noticed during a previous crossing when he had been positioned near the rear of the column and had seen moisture seeping from a specific crack in a sandstone outcropping. Ibrahim al-Rashid had been skeptical. The other guards had laughed at the idea of taking navigation advice from a piece of cargo, but desperation creates its own logic, and the alternative was watching the entire enterprise die of thirst within sight of the eternal dunes. The spring was exactly where Kofi had said it would be. Enough water to refill the gourds, to revive the weakest captives, to save the caravan and its valuable human cargo. From that day forward, Kofi's status had shifted. He was still property. He was still chained at night. He was still subject to the arbitrary cruelties that characterized life within the Zariba. But he was also valuable in a way that provided certain protections. He was moved from the general population to a smaller enclosure near the guard quarters. His food ration increased slightly. He was given a sleeping mat instead of bare earth. And most importantly, he was brought along on nearly every major caravan that Ibrahim al-Rashid organized. He walked at the front of the column instead of the middle. He was consulted about routes, about timing, about the location of water sources. He saw everything. He heard everything. He remembered everything. The transformation happened so gradually that no one noticed it occurring. Not Ibrahim al-Rashid, who had already forgotten that his prized navigator was a human being with an inner life. Not the guards, who saw only a useful tool that occasionally needed feeding and watering. Not even the other captives who viewed Kofi with a mixture of envy and suspicion, uncertain whether his improved circumstances made him a collaborator or simply another victim playing the cards he had been dealt. But inside that quiet man with the watchful eyes, something was being constructed. A map, yes, but not just a map of terrain. A map of the entire system. A map of guard rotations and supply chains and communication networks. A map of weaknesses and vulnerabilities. A map of exactly how and where and when the structure could be collapsed. 14 years of observation. 14 years of patience. 14 years of being underestimated by men who could not conceive that the property might be studying them even as they studied their profit margins. The desert had taught Kofi something that his captors had never understood. The desert does not care about wealth or status, or the cruelties that men inflict upon one another. The desert cares only about knowledge. Those who understand its ways survive. Those who don't, regardless of how many armed guards they employ, eventually become bones bleaching under the relentless sun. And Kofi understood the desert better than any of them. Leave in the comments, never give up on truth, if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The escalation began with small things, as it always does. A caravan that lost its way despite perfect conditions. A water cache that had been mysteriously fouled. A group of captives who escaped during a night when the guards were convinced they had secured every possible exit. Ibrahim al-Rashid did not connect these incidents at first. The desert was vast, and even the most experienced traders expected a certain percentage of losses. A camel might go lame. A sandstorm might delay a shipment. Captives died of disease or despair, or the simple inability of the human body to withstand indefinite abuse. These were understood costs, factored into the prices, absorbed into the calculus of profit. But the losses were increasing. Slowly at first, then with alarming speed. In the spring of 1838, 3 separate caravans from Ibrahim al-Rashid's network experienced catastrophic failures. The first lost its entire water supply when a pack camel stumbled into a ravine that the lead guide had somehow failed to notice. 16 captives died before they reached the next water source. The second caravan was attacked by raiders who seemed to know exactly when and where the shipment would be most vulnerable, who targeted not the captives but the guards themselves, killing 7 men and disappearing into the desert before any pursuit could be organized. The third simply vanished. 42 captives, 5 guards, 8 camels loaded with supplies, gone as if the sand had opened up and swallowed them whole. The other traders began to talk. In the coffee houses of Khartoum, in the counting rooms of the merchants who finance these operations, in the quarters where the guards gathered to gamble and boast, whispers circulated. Ibrahim al-Rashid was losing his grip. His operation was cursed. Something was hunting him. The man himself refused to believe in curses or supernatural intervention. He was a businessman, a rationalist within the twisted logic of his chosen profession. He hired additional guards. He changed his routes. He executed 3 men whom he suspected of selling information to rivals. He offered rewards for intelligence about the raiders who had struck his second caravan. None of it helped. What Ibrahim al-Rashid could not understand, what his rational mind could not accept, was that the attack was coming from inside his own operation. From a man he saw every day. From a man whose chains he had personally inspected on countless occasions. From a man whose continued survival depended entirely on his usefulness to the very enterprise that was now bleeding from 1,000 small wounds. Kofi had started slowly, testing the limits of what was possible. The first accident had been the fouled water cache. He had added a particular desert plant to the water store, one that looked like the edible varieties that grew near oases, one that was toxic enough to make the water undrinkable, but not so obviously poisonous that suspicion would fall on deliberate sabotage. The guards had blamed local Bedouins. Kofi had said nothing, had simply filed away the lesson. With the right approach, actions could be made to look like accidents or enemy activity. The escaped captives had been more complex. Kofi had spent months studying the patterns of the night guards, learning which ones drank too heavily, which ones fell asleep at their posts, which sections of the Zariba's thorny perimeter had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who knew exactly where to push. He had communicated with 3 young men in the general enclosure, using a system of subtle hand signals that he had developed over years of observation, teaching them the route to a particular village 3 days to the south, where he knew the inhabitants had no love for the slavers. The 3 had made it. Kofi had heard reports weeks later, filtered through the guard gossip that he monitored constantly. 3 captives gone, never recaptured, presumably dead in the desert. But Kofi knew better. The accidents that struck the caravans were more elaborate. They required Kofi to use his position as navigator to subtly misdirect, to guide columns toward terrain that looked safe but concealed dangers, to time movement so that they reached certain stretches of the route during the hours when visibility was worst, when the desert played its tricks on tired eyes. He never did anything obvious. He never gave directions that were clearly wrong. He simply adjusted. A slight deviation here, placing the caravan on ground that would be harder on the camels. A delay there, ensuring they would make camp in a location more vulnerable to nighttime attack. Information passed through channels he had cultivated, reaching the ears of raiders who had their own grudges against the slavers, who were happy to act on intelligence that arrived mysteriously from within the system itself. But these were pinpricks. Painful for Ibrahim al-Rashid, certainly. Damaging to his reputation and his profits, but not enough to bring down the system. Not enough to achieve what Kofi had been building toward for more than a decade. The real planning began in earnest after what happened to Mariama. She was 14 years old when they brought her into the Zariba. Kofi knew her origins without anyone telling him, could read the marks of her homeland in the particular scarification patterns on her cheeks, in the way she held herself despite everything that had been done to her, in the words she whispered to herself in a language that Kofi had not heard spoken since he was torn from his own village 17 years before. She was from his people, not from his village, which had long since been scattered to the winds, but from the same cultural root, the same traditions, the same understanding of the world and humanity's place within it. Kofi had learned, over his years of captivity, to close off the parts of himself that felt. Empathy was dangerous when you were surrounded by suffering that you could do nothing to prevent. Connection was a liability when the people you cared about could be sold, separated, destroyed at any moment by the whim of men who saw them as nothing more than profitable livestock. But Mariama cracked something open inside him. Perhaps because she reminded him of a sister he had once had, a girl named Adwoa, who had been killed during the raid on their village when she tried to run. Perhaps because her youth and her terror and her quiet dignity in the face of horror recalled his own early days in captivity, when he had still believed that surely someone would come to rescue them, that this nightmare could not possibly continue indefinitely. He began to watch out for her in small ways, making sure that word reached the handlers that she was to be treated carefully, that she had value that would be diminished by excessive mistreatment, using his limited influence to have her assigned to work duties that were marginally less brutal than the alternatives, finding ways to ensure that she received a slightly larger share of the inadequate food rations. She noticed. She was not stupid, this girl from his homeland. She saw the quiet man who walked at the front of the caravans, who was treated with a grudging respect by even the cruelest guards, who moved through the Zariba with a freedom of movement that no other captive enjoyed. She wondered about him. She tried to communicate, using the old words, the phrases that connected them across the unbridgeable gulf of their circumstances. Kofi did not respond. He could not afford to. Any visible connection between them would make both of them vulnerable, would invite questions, would threaten the invisible position he had constructed for himself over years of patient work. But he watched, and he planned, and he began to think about how he might include her in the escape he had been building toward, how he might find a way to save at least one member of his scattered people from the machine that had consumed so many. Then Ibrahim al-Rashid decided to sell her. Not to a regular buyer, not through the normal market channels. Mariama had attracted the attention of a visiting merchant from the north, a man whose tastes ran toward the young and the vulnerable, whose reputation preceded him through whispered warnings that passed between the captive women whenever he was known to be in the area. Kofi heard about the sale from one of the guards, a man who had developed a habit of talking to the navigator during long stretches of trail, who didn't see any reason to filter his words in the presence of what he still thought of as an intelligent animal. "The girl with the face marks," the guard said, laughing at some private joke. "Al-Rashid got 3 times the normal price for her. That northern pig knows what he likes, and he pays well for it." The transaction would take place in 4 days. The merchant was preparing to leave, and Mariama would go with him, into a fate that everyone in the Zariba understood, but no one spoke of directly. Kofi said nothing. His face betrayed nothing. He continued walking at the front of the column, reading the desert, guiding his captors safely across terrain that he could have led them into 100 different traps. But that night, alone in his small enclosure, he made a decision that had been building for 17 years. The careful plan, the slow accumulation of advantages, the patient waiting for the perfect moment, all of it was set aside. He would act. He would act now. He would act regardless of the consequences, and if he was going to strike, he would not strike at one merchant, one caravan, one small piece of the machine. He would strike at the heart. He would bring down Ibrahim al-Rashid's entire network. He would free not just Mariama, but every captive in the Zariba. He would create chaos so complete that the reverberations would be felt across the entire trade network. It was suicide. He understood that. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 17 years of slavery, screamed at him that this was foolishness, that he was throwing away everything he had built for the sake of one girl who would probably die anyway, that his best chance of eventual freedom lay in continued patience, continued invisibility, continued service to men who would eventually make a mistake that he could exploit. But there was another voice, older and deeper, a voice that spoke in the language of his childhood, that reminded him of who he had been before the chains, that asked him what kind of man survives by perpetuating the very evil that had destroyed his world. Mariama had 4 days. Kofi had 17 years of accumulated knowledge about exactly how to use them. The players assembled without knowing they were being assembled. Kofi had spent over a decade identifying potential allies, people within the system whose hatred burned hot enough that they might risk everything if given the opportunity, but who had learned, like him, to hide that hatred beneath masks of compliance and submission. There was Amara, a woman in her 40s who had been enslaved for nearly as long as Kofi himself. She had survived by making herself useful to the Zariba's makeshift kitchen, cooking the gruel that kept the captives alive. But Kofi knew her history. He knew that she had watched her 2 sons sold separately when they were barely old enough to walk, sent to different buyers in different markets, lost forever into the vast machinery of the trade. He knew that she kept a small bag of poisonous seeds hidden beneath her sleeping mat, seeds she had been gathering for years, waiting for the moment when she could add them to the guards' food and take as many of them with her as possible when she finally chose to die. There was Kwame, a young man barely out of adolescence who had been captured only 2 years earlier, but whose fury had never dimmed, whose eyes followed the guards with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. The breakers had worked on him for weeks when he first arrived, trying to crush his spirit through systematic brutality. They thought they had succeeded. They saw a compliant, docile young man who had learned his place. They did not see what Kofi saw, a rage so pure and cold that it had frozen into something like patience, something like calculation, something very dangerous. There was Hassan, an anomaly in the system, a guard who had begun questioning the work he did. He was the son of a freed slave, a man whose mother had bought her freedom through years of domestic service, who had raised her son with stories of her own captivity that were meant to instill gratitude for their current circumstances, but had instead planted seeds of doubt. Hassan had joined the guards because it was well-paying work for a young man with few options, but the longer he served, the more the reality of what he was doing ate at him. Kofi had watched him for months, had tested his reactions through careful provocations, had determined that this was a man who might turn if approached correctly. There were others. A healer named Issa, who was trusted to move throughout the compound, treating injuries and illnesses. A group of 3 brothers captured together, who had sworn to each other that they would escape or die trying. A woman named Fatima, whose apparent madness concealed a sharp mind, who had learned that the guards left her alone if they thought she was broken beyond usefulness. Kofi approached each of them separately, using methods he had developed over years of necessity. A word dropped here, a signal there, a piece of information passed through hands that had learned to communicate without speaking. He did not tell any of them the full plan. He told each only what they needed to know to play their part. The plan itself was elegant in its complexity, relying on the intimate knowledge of the Zariba's operations that Kofi had accumulated over 17 years. It had multiple phases, multiple contingencies, multiple ways to proceed if certain elements failed. Phase 1. The water. Amara's poisonous seeds would not go into the guards' food, where they might be detected and where they would not affect enough targets simultaneously. Instead, they would be dissolved in the water supply that served the guard quarters. Not enough to kill, Kofi had calculated the dosage carefully, but enough to incapacitate, enough to create confusion, enough to create a window of opportunity. Phase 2. The fire. The Zariba's acacia walls were its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. They were designed to keep captives in and raiders out, but they were also made of dried wood, maintained through regular applications of oil to prevent cracking in the harsh desert climate. Oil that would burn hot and fast once ignited. Phase 3. The diversion. A group of captives, carefully selected for their speed and their knowledge of the surrounding terrain, would break through a specific section of the wall where Kofi knew the foundation was weakest. Their escape would draw the attention of whatever guards remained functional, pulling them away from the main enclosures. Phase 4. The liberation. In the chaos of the fire and the pursuit of the escapees, the remaining captives would be freed from their enclosures. They would be organized into groups, each led by someone Kofi had prepared, each directed toward a different escape route, scattering across the desert in so many directions that pursuit would be impossible. Phase 5. The destruction. Ibrahim al-Rashid's compound held something that was arguably more valuable than any human cargo: his records. Years of careful documentation, names and numbers and routes and contacts, the administrative architecture of an empire built on suffering. Kofi intended to destroy all of it. Without those records, the network would be crippled. Relationships would have to be rebuilt. Trust would have to be reestablished. The disruption would be felt for years. Phase 6. The message. The northern merchant who had purchased Mariama would receive a very different delivery than the one he expected. Kofi had plans for that man, plans that involved the desert and the knowledge of its hidden places and the things that could happen to a person when they were alone in an environment they did not understand. The timing was critical. Everything had to happen on a specific night, during a specific window when the guard rotations created a brief period of reduced surveillance. That night was 3 days away. The night before, Mariama was scheduled to be transferred to her buyer. Kofi gave the signal, and his network began to move. The day before the strike, a terrible silence settled over the Zariba. It was the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed against the ears, that made even the constant desert wind seem muted and distant. Ibrahim al-Rashid was hosting a celebration. The northern merchant whose purchase had sealed Mariama's fate had arrived a day early, accompanied by a retinue of servants and guards. The transaction had been completed, and now there was feasting, music, the consumption of quantities of food and drink that the captives in their enclosures could only imagine. From his position in the smaller enclosure near the guard quarters, Kofi could hear the sounds of revelry drifting across the compound. Laughter, the rhythmic beating of drums, voices raised in songs that celebrated the wealth and success of men who had built their fortunes on human misery. He used the noise as cover, making his final preparations. The seeds had been delivered to Amara that morning, passed through a chain of hands that could not be traced. She would add them to the water supply at sunset, timing the dose so that the effects would peak in the deepest hours of the night. The oil had been distributed to the sections of wall where it would do the most damage, small additions to the regular maintenance supplies that would go unnoticed until the flames began to spread. The runners, the group selected to create the initial diversion, had been briefed through the elaborate system of signals that Kofi had developed. They knew their role. They knew the route. They knew that their survival depended on running faster and longer than anyone thought possible. Hassan, the conflicted guard, had arranged to be assigned to the North Watchtower that night. His position gave him control over the alarm bell that would normally summon the guards to respond to any disturbance. He would not ring it. Not until the fire had taken hold. Not until escape had become inevitable. Kofi went through the checklist in his mind, again and again, testing each element for weaknesses, looking for flaws in his logic, searching for the thing he might have missed. After 17 years of planning, of observation, of careful construction, everything came down to the next 12 hours. In the main enclosure, Mariama sat with her back against the wooden post where she had been confined since her purchase. She did not know what was coming. Kofi had been unable to communicate with her directly, unwilling to risk exposing the plan through any action that might be observed and questioned. She would learn, along with everyone else, when the night exploded into chaos. But she would survive. She had to survive. Kofi had not thrown away 17 years of patient work, had not risked everything he had built, for any other outcome. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The celebration in Ibrahim al-Rashid's quarters grew louder. The guards who were not participating in the festivities settled into their routine positions, looking forward to a quiet night. Kofi closed his eyes. He recited, silently, the prayers of his childhood, words in a language that his captors did not know, invocations to spirits and ancestors whose power might or might not extend to this distant place, this land of sand and suffering, and the faint hope of justice. Then he opened his eyes and began to wait for midnight. The first sign that something was wrong came at the 3rd hour after sunset. A guard named Yusuf, who had drawn the short lot for perimeter patrol while his companions enjoyed the celebration, began vomiting uncontrollably behind the storage shed. He thought it was something he had eaten. He did not connect his sudden illness to the water he had drunk from the communal barrel 2 hours earlier. By the 4th hour, 7 more guards were showing symptoms: cramping, dizziness, an urgent need to relieve themselves that left them squatting in uncomfortable positions far from their posts. The remaining guards tried to cover for their stricken companions, spreading themselves thin across a compound that normally required twice their number to properly patrol. Ibrahim al-Rashid, deep in his celebration, did not notice the disruption. The northern merchant had brought gifts of hashish and strong spirits. The drums beat on. The laughter continued. The guards who served the feast were too busy refilling cups and carrying plates to notice that their colleagues outside were slowly collapsing. At the 5th hour, Amara slipped away from the kitchen compound. Her work was done, and now she had a different role to play. She made her way to the section of wall near the women's enclosure, where she had hidden a small clay pot containing embers from the cooking fire. She retrieved the pot. She waited. Kofi moved through the darkness with the confidence of a man who had walked these grounds thousands of times. The guards who might have stopped him were either sick or distracted. The ones who saw him assumed he was on some errand, perhaps fetching supplies for the morning caravan, perhaps checking on the camels in their pen. No one thought to question the walking map. No one ever questioned the walking map. He reached the gate to the main enclosure where the captives were held. It was locked with a heavy wooden beam, guarded by a single man who was leaning against the wall, struggling to keep his eyes open, fighting against whatever was churning in his stomach. Kofi approached him openly. "Water," he said, holding out a gourd. "For your stomach." The guard took it gratefully. He drank deeply. He did not taste the additional herbs that Kofi had added, the ones that would push him from illness into unconsciousness within minutes. 3 minutes later, the guard slumped to the ground. Kofi lifted the beam. He opened the gate. He stepped into the enclosure where 123 human beings were waiting for a freedom they did not know was coming. He spoke quickly, quietly, in the language of his captors, the only common tongue among captives gathered from a dozen different peoples. He explained what was happening. He assigned roles. He organized groups. He pointed to the leaders he had selected, men and women who knew their destinations, who had memorized the routes he had taught them through weeks of clandestine communication. "When the fire starts," he said, "you run. You do not look back. You do not wait. You run, and you do not stop until you reach safety." Questions, objections, disbelief. He had expected all of it. He had no time for any of it. "Watch the walls," he said. "When they burn, the gates will open. This is your only chance. Take it or die here." Then he turned and slipped back into the darkness, leaving behind him 100 whispered conversations, 100 hearts beating faster, 100 souls preparing to gamble everything on the word of a man they had watched walk at the front of their chains for years. He found Mariama where he knew she would be, in the smaller enclosure reserved for high-value cargo awaiting special transport. She was awake, watching the strange activity with wide eyes, sensing that something was different about this night. "Sister," he said, using the word from their shared language, the first time he had spoken to her directly since her arrival. She startled. She stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Brother?" The question was tentative, disbelieving, hopeful. "There is no time. When the fire starts, stay close to me. Do exactly what I say. We are going home." Tears began to flow down her cheeks. She did not understand. She could not understand. But she nodded, and that was enough. Kofi looked up at the sky. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, the same stars he had used to navigate these deserts for 17 years. He found the particular constellation that his people believed contained the spirits of their ancestors, the watching ones who guided their children through darkness toward the dawn. He breathed deeply. He centered himself. Then he gave the signal, and the zariba of Ibrahim al-Rashid began to burn. The flames caught faster than anyone could have predicted. The oil-soaked sections of wall went up like torches, sending columns of fire into the night sky that could be seen for miles. Within minutes, the careful architecture of the compound was transformed into an inferno. The first screams came from the guard quarters, where men who were already weakened by illness stumbled out of their beds into smoke-filled corridors. The second screams came from Ibrahim al-Rashid's celebration chamber, where the merchant and his companions, slow and confused from their indulgences, struggled to understand what was happening. Hassan rang the alarm bell, but he rang it in a pattern that every trained guard knew meant external attack. The response it triggered was exactly what Kofi had anticipated. The remaining capable guards rushed toward the outer walls, looking for enemies that did not exist, leaving the interior of the compound virtually undefended. The runners broke through the weakened section of wall, exactly as planned. A handful of guards gave chase, disappearing into the darkness, following decoys who would lead them on a fruitless pursuit across miles of desert, and in the main enclosure, the captives began to pour out through the open gate. The chaos was total. The organization was perfect. Each group moved toward its assigned exit point, led by people who knew exactly where to go, who had memorized routes that would take them to safety through terrain that no pursuit could follow. Kofi moved through the pandemonium like a man walking through a dream. He had Mariama's hand in his, pulling her along, navigating by instinct and memory through smoke and flame and the sounds of a world collapsing. They passed the storage shed where Ibrahim al-Rashid kept his records. Kofi paused just long enough to ensure that the fire had reached it, that the papers and ledgers were already curling into ash, that the administrative machinery of the network was being consumed along with everything else. They passed the stable where the camels were screaming in their pens. Kofi stopped again. He opened the gates. The animals fled into the night, scattering in all directions, removing any possibility of mounted pursuit. They passed the quarters of the northern merchant, and here Kofi paused longest of all. The building was burning, but not completely. Through the smoke, he could see movement inside, a figure stumbling toward the door, seeking escape. The merchant emerged, coughing, disoriented, still dressed in the fine robes he had worn to celebrate his purchase. He looked around wildly, trying to make sense of the destruction surrounding him. His eyes found Kofi, found the man standing calmly in the midst of chaos, holding the hand of the girl who was supposed to be his property. "You," the merchant said. His voice was hoarse with smoke, sharp with sudden understanding. "You did this." Kofi said nothing. He simply stood there, letting the flames paint his face in dancing shadows, letting the man see him clearly for the first and last time. "Do you know who I am?" the merchant screamed. "Do you know what I will do to you? I will find you. I will hunt you down. I will make you suffer in ways you cannot imagine." Kofi smiled. It was the first smile that had crossed his face in 17 years. "You will do nothing," he said, and his voice was calm, peaceful, almost gentle. "You will walk into the desert. You will walk north, toward your home. You will walk alone, without water, without provisions, without any knowledge of where you are or how to survive." The merchant's face contorted with rage. "I will not. I will stay here. I will wait for rescue. They will find me." "No one is coming," Kofi said. "This compound has been destroyed. Your guards are dead or fled. Your host is fighting for his life in the ruins of his own empire. There is no one left to help you." He pointed north, toward the featureless expanse of desert that separated this place from the merchant's homeland. "That way is Egypt. 300 miles of sand. 20 days of walking if you know the routes. If you don't." He let the sentence trail off. The meaning was clear enough. The merchant looked at the burning compound. He looked at the darkness beyond. He looked at the man who had orchestrated his destruction. "Please," he whispered, and the word contained everything: the fear, the desperation, the sudden understanding that he was alone and helpless, and facing the same fate he had inflicted on countless others. Kofi turned away. He pulled Mariama with him, moving toward the edge of the compound, toward the darkness, toward the escape routes that he had mapped in his mind over 17 years of patient observation. Behind them, the merchant screamed his name, screamed threats, screamed pleas. The screams grew fainter as they walked, swallowed by the desert that did not care about merchants or slaves or the small dramas of human cruelty. The merchant's body was found 3 weeks later by a Bedouin hunting party, 30 miles north of the burned compound. He had made it further than Kofi had expected, but not far enough. Never far enough. The column of escaped captives stretched across the desert like a river of shadows, moving under cover of darkness, guided by stars and by the man who walked at their head. There had been resistance. Not everyone had wanted to leave. Some had been too afraid, too broken, too certain that any escape attempt would end in recapture and brutal punishment. Some had questioned whether they could trust the man who had served their captors for so long, who had led so many caravans, who had been given privileges that no other captive enjoyed. Kofi had not argued with them. He had not tried to convince them. He had simply pointed toward the burning compound and asked a single question. "Do you want to stay in that?" Most had come. Nearly 100 souls, moving together through terrain that should have been impassable, surviving on water that materialized from sources that only Kofi knew, eating from caches of food that he had secretly positioned along escape routes over years of apparent loyal service. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of walking through heat and sand and the constant fear of pursuit. 11 days of watching the horizon for the dust clouds that would signal approaching riders. 11 days of rationing water and food and hope. They lost people along the way. An elderly woman whose body simply gave out on the 4th day. 2 young children whose mother had to make the unthinkable choice between stopping to bury them and continuing on to save herself and her other children. A man who wandered away from the column during a rest stop and was never seen again. But they kept moving. They kept surviving. They kept following the man who had memorized every route, every water source, every landmark in this vast and hostile expanse. Mariama walked beside Kofi when she could, absorbing everything he could teach her about the desert, about survival, about the land that might become her home for whatever time remained to her. She learned that he had been taken from a village near the coast, in a land that the Europeans called the Gold Coast, far to the west across forests and rivers, and peoples that neither of them would ever see again. She learned that he had a wife once, a young woman named Essie who had been killed in the raid that captured him. She learned that his real name was not Kofi at all, that it was a name he had taken from a dead man during the long march to the coast, hoping that by taking another's identity, he might somehow escape his own fate. His true name, he told her, was Yaw, born on a Thursday, named for the god of the day of his birth, as was the custom of their people. "Yaw is dead," she said quietly. "He has been dead for 17 years. "Yes," he agreed. "Yaw died in chains on a ship crossing the Great Water. What walks now is something else. A ghost, a memory, a debt collector." "What will you collect?" she asked. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, that had calculated too many distances, that had mapped too many paths through darkness. "Everything," he said. "I will collect everything they owe." They reached the village on the 12th day. It was a settlement of the Kababish people, nomads who moved through the western deserts, who had no love for the slavers who disrupted their traditional trading routes, who had sheltered escaped captives before when circumstances allowed. The village elders received Kofi with a mixture of suspicion and wonder. They knew who he was. His reputation had spread across the desert long before he arrived. The walking map. The navigator who had served Ibrahim al-Rashid for 17 years. The man who was either the most valuable asset in the Western trade or the most dangerous enemy anyone could imagine. Now they knew which one he truly was. Kofi negotiated with them for hours, using all the diplomatic skills he had developed over years of observing how his captors dealt with one another. He offered information about the routes, about the water sources, about the positions of the remaining slavers' compounds. He offered his knowledge as a payment for sanctuary, for protection, for the chance to rest and recover before continuing the fight. The elders accepted. Not because they trusted him, not because they believed his promises, but because they understood the calculation he was presenting. A man who could bring down Ibrahim al-Rashid, who could burn a zariba to the ground and escape with nearly 100 captives, was a man worth having as an ally, rather than an enemy. The escaped captives were divided among the Kababish clans. Some would remain, adopting new lives among the nomads. Others would continue on to different destinations, following routes that Kofi provided, seeking homes in communities that might accept them. A few expressed interest in joining Kofi for what came next. Because this was not the end, this was barely the beginning. Ibrahim al-Rashid had survived the fire. Kofi learned this from travelers who passed through the village, from the network of informants he was already beginning to build, from the desert telegraph that carried news across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. The slaver had been badly burned, had lost most of his guards, had watched his compound and his records turn to ash. But he was alive, and he was rebuilding. More importantly, Ibrahim al-Rashid was not the only slaver operating in the region. He was not even the most powerful. He was one node in a vast network that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea, that moved tens of thousands of human beings every year, that would continue its work regardless of what happened to any single operation. Kofi had destroyed one compound. He had freed one group of captives. He had sent a message that resonated across the desert like a thunderclap. But the system remained intact. The roads remained open. The caravans still moved, day after day, carrying their human cargo toward markets where lives were bought and sold as casually as grain or livestock. One man could not destroy such a system. Kofi knew this. He had always known this. But one man could teach others. One man could share what he knew. One man could take the methods he had developed, the knowledge he had accumulated, the techniques of sabotage and escape and resistance, and spread them across the desert like seeds scattered before a wind. This was what Kofi began to do in the weeks that followed his escape. He sent messages to contacts he had cultivated during his years of service, people who worked within other compounds, who had access to other routes, who had been waiting for someone to show them that resistance was possible. He provided information, guard rotations, supply schedules, structural weaknesses in compound defenses. He provided routes, escape paths through terrain that the slavers did not know, water sources that did not appear on any map, safe havens where escaped captives could find shelter. He provided hope. And slowly, across the vastness of the Sudanese desert, the fires began to spread. The reports that arrived at the Ottoman governor's office in Khartoum during the autumn of 1839 painted a picture of escalating chaos. Compound after compound was experiencing accidents. Caravans were disappearing. Captives were escaping in numbers that defied explanation. The governor, a man named Ahmed Pasha, who cared more about maintaining order than about the moral implications of the trade he was supposed to regulate, demanded answers. His subordinates had none to give him. The pattern was clear, but inexplicable. The attacks were coordinated. They struck at the most vulnerable points in the slavers' operations. They demonstrated knowledge of routes, schedules, and procedures that should have been closely guarded secrets. But there was no identifiable enemy, no army, no organized force that could be targeted and destroyed. Just a series of seemingly unrelated disasters, each one weakening the network a little more. Each one demonstrating that the system that had operated with impunity for generations was suddenly, mysteriously, vulnerable. The slavers themselves knew who was responsible. The name of the walking map had spread among them like a disease. Some claimed he was dead, killed in the fire that destroyed Ibrahim al-Rashid's compound. Others insisted he had been sighted in a dozen different locations, always one step ahead of the hunters who pursued him, always appearing just before disaster struck. He became a legend, a ghost story that slavers told each other in hushed voices around campfires, warning one another to watch their captives more carefully, to trust their guides less completely, to remember that property was not always as docile as it appeared. The methods he had developed began to spread, captured from the same region, held in the same compound, taught by the same quiet man who had pretended for 17 years to be nothing more than a useful tool. The survivors carried his techniques with them as they scattered across the desert. A compound near El Fasher burned under circumstances strikingly similar to what had happened to Ibrahim al-Rashid. 15 captives escaped, guided by a man who had served as a water carrier for 3 years, who had spent those years memorizing routes and cultivating contacts and waiting for the moment to act. A caravan on the northern route lost its entire water supply when someone introduced contaminants to the storage gourds during a night stop. The guards survived. The captives did not. But neither did the captain of the caravan, who was found 3 days later with his throat cut, his body left as a message at a crossroads where 3 major routes converged. A slave market in Shendi erupted in violence when a group of captives, apparently subdued and ready for sale, produced weapons that had been smuggled to them by a contact within the city. 37 escaped in the confusion. The market never fully recovered. Each incident was different. Each had its own local circumstances, its own particular triggers, its own cast of desperate people willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. But they all bore the hallmarks of the same underlying methodology. Map the system, identify weaknesses, cultivate allies, strike when least expected, create chaos that allows escape, disappear into terrain that the pursuers cannot navigate. The walking map's technique, the ghost's gift to his scattered people. By the end of 1839, the western trade routes had become so dangerous that several major traders announced they were suspending operations. The insurance rates for caravans traveling through the affected regions tripled, then quadrupled. Guards demanded hazard pay. Guides began refusing to work unless accompanied by military escorts. The system was not destroyed. It would take decades more, and the intervention of colonial powers with their own complicated motivations before the trans-Saharan slave trade finally collapsed. But something had shifted in the autumn of 1839. Something that the men who profited from human misery could feel in their bones, even if they could not name it. They were not invincible. Their victims were not helpless. The roads that had carried chains for centuries could also carry rebellion, if someone knew how to use them. The British consul in Khartoum, a man named John Petherick, who would later become famous for his explorations of the Upper Nile, sent a remarkable dispatch to his superiors in Cairo in December 1839. The letter, which survived in the Foreign Office archives, describes conversations he had with local informants about the disturbances affecting the slave trade. "There is much talk," Petherick wrote, "of a certain individual who is credited with orchestrating the recent troubles. He is variously described as a spirit, a demon, a prophet, or simply an extraordinarily cunning escaped slave who has turned his intimate knowledge of the trade routes against his former masters. I have been unable to verify his existence, let alone his whereabouts, but the belief in him among both the traders and the enslaved population is fervent and unshakable." Petherick went on to describe the impact of the troubles on the regional economy. Prices for enslaved people in the Khartoum markets had risen sharply as supply contracted. Several prominent traders had fled the region entirely, citing inability to operate profitably under the current conditions. The Ottoman authorities were increasingly concerned about the loss of tax revenue and the general breakdown of order along the western routes. "What strikes me most," Petherick continued, "is the psychological effect on the trade itself. The traders I have spoken with are frightened men. They look over their shoulders constantly. They trust no one, least of all their own guides and servants. They speak of the ghost as if he were omnipresent, capable of appearing anywhere, knowing everything, able to turn their own operations against them at any moment. Whether this individual exists as a single person or has become a symbol for a broader movement of resistance, the practical effect is the same. The slavers' confidence in their own security has been shattered." The letter concludes with a passage that has been quoted by historians seeking to understand the origins of organized resistance to the trans-Saharan slave trade. "I find myself moved by the thought that somewhere in this vast desert, a man exists who has found a way to fight back against a system of almost unimaginable cruelty. Whether he is real or legendary, he represents something that the traders and their official enablers fear more than any military force. The possibility that knowledge can be turned into a weapon, that patience can become strategy, that the oppressed can learn to use the very systems that oppress them as instruments of their own liberation. If such a man exists, I hope he survives long enough to see his methods spread beyond this corner of Africa to every place where human beings are bought and sold like cattle." The consul's hope was partially fulfilled. The methods did spread. The techniques of resistance that originated in the burning compound of Ibrahim al-Rashid were carried by survivors and witnesses across thousands of miles, adapted to different circumstances, refined through trial and error, passed from generation to generation. But the man himself? The walking map? The ghost of the desert routes? His ultimate fate remains unknown. The hunters came, as Kofi had always known they would. Not immediately. Not in the chaotic weeks after the destruction of Ibrahim al-Rashid's compound, when every slaver in the region was too busy protecting his own operations to organize a coordinated pursuit. But eventually, inevitably, The powers that depended on the continuation of the trade decided that the symbol of resistance had to be eliminated. In February 1840, a column of 200 armed men assembled at the garrison in El Fasher. They were a mixed force: Ottoman regulars, tribal levies loyal to trading families, mercenaries hired specifically for the task. They were led by a man named Osman Digna, a professional soldier who had made his reputation suppressing rebellions in the Egyptian borderlands, who approached the hunt for the walking map as a military campaign rather than a simple pursuit. Osman Digna was smart. He understood that his target could not be caught through superior force alone. The desert was too vast, the potential hiding places too numerous, the local population too sympathetic to the escaped slaves who had found refuge among them. He would need to cut off Kofi's support network, to isolate him from the communities that provided shelter and information, to force him into open terrain where his knowledge of the routes would not be sufficient protection. The campaign began with punitive expeditions against villages suspected of harboring escaped captives. The Kababish settlements that had first offered sanctuary to Kofi's group were particularly targeted. Livestock was confiscated. Wells were fouled. Young men were conscripted into labor battalions. The message was clear: anyone who helped the ghost would share his fate. Kofi responded by escalating his own operations. If Osman Digna wanted to create a climate of fear, Kofi would create his own. Patrols were ambushed. Supply lines were cut. Scouts disappeared and were found days later, their bodies arranged as warnings at locations that held symbolic significance to the hunting force. The campaign devolved into a brutal game of cat and mouse across hundreds of square miles of desert. Osman Digna would receive intelligence about Kofi's location and march his forces to intercept, only to find the reported camp abandoned, the trail cold, his target vanished into the immensity of the landscape. Kofi would strike at the column's weakest points, killing a few soldiers here, destroying a water supply there, never engaging in a direct confrontation that would expose his small band to annihilation. Months passed. The hot season arrived, making movement during daylight hours almost impossible. Osman Digna's force was exhausted, demoralized, decimated as much by disease and desertion as by enemy action. The hunters had become the hunted, chasing a ghost across a landscape that seemed determined to protect him. Then, in July 1840, everything changed. The betrayal came from within Kofi's own network. A man named Salim, who had been part of the original escape from Ibrahim al-Rashid's compound, who had been trusted with knowledge of safe houses and supply caches, who had participated in half a dozen operations against the slavers, sold information to Osman Digna's agents in exchange for a promise of amnesty and a substantial reward. The details of how Salim was turned remain unclear. Later accounts suggest that his family had been captured in one of Osman Digna's punitive expeditions, that he was offered their freedom in exchange for his betrayal, that he convinced himself he was saving lives rather than trading them. Whatever his motivations, the effect was devastating. Kofi's main camp, hidden in a canyon system that had served as his base of operations for nearly a year, was attacked at dawn on July 17, 1840. The assault was overwhelming. 200 soldiers against fewer than 40 fighters, with complete tactical surprise and superior weapons. The battle lasted less than an hour. Kofi's band fought with the desperation of people who knew that capture meant a fate worse than death, but numbers and firepower told. One by one, the defenders fell, their bodies tumbling across the rocky ground that had been their last refuge. Kofi himself was not among the dead. Witnesses reported seeing him fighting near the canyon's narrow entrance, holding off the attackers long enough for some of his people to escape through a hidden passage at the rear of their position. Mariama was among those who escaped, guided by routes that Kofi had made sure she memorized, carrying knowledge that would allow her to continue the work even if he fell. The last confirmed sighting of the walking map was from a soldier named Ibrahim Rashid, no relation to the slaver whose compound had started everything, who was part of the force that finally breached the canyon's defenses. In his later account, written decades afterward when he was an old man with much to regret, he described encountering a tall, thin man with graying hair and calm, watchful eyes, standing alone in the center of the camp while his companions fled. He looked at me, Ibrahim Rashid wrote, and I felt as if he could see through me, through my uniform, through my weapons, through everything I thought I was. He did not try to fight. He did not try to run. He simply stood there, waiting, as if this moment had been scheduled long ago and he was merely keeping an appointment. What happened next is unclear. Ibrahim Rashid's account becomes vague at this point, suggesting that the chaos of battle prevented him from witnessing the final moments. Other sources claim that Kofi was killed fighting, that his body was displayed in El Fasher as proof of the ghost's mortality, that Osman Digna received promotion and rewards for ending the threat to the trade routes. But other accounts tell a different story. They claim that the body displayed in El Fasher was not Kofi's, that the man who was killed in the canyon was a decoy, that the walking map had used the attack as cover for his final disappearance. They claim that he was seen afterward in villages across the region, always briefly, always on the move, always teaching others what he knew before vanishing into the desert that had been his home for so long. The truth, like so much about this story, has been swallowed by the sands. The years that followed the Battle of the Canyon saw the gradual decline of the organized resistance that Kofi had sparked. Without his coordinating intelligence, without his encyclopedic knowledge of the routes and the systems, without his ability to see the whole board while others saw only their individual pieces, the scattered cells of rebellion lost their effectiveness. But the decline was slow, and it was never complete. The methods survived even as the man who had developed them became legend. Escaped captives continued to use the routes he had mapped, continued to find the water sources he had identified, continued to seek refuge in communities he had cultivated as allies. The fires that burned across the desert in 1839 and 1840 left embers that smoldered for decades. In 1874, when Charles Gordon was appointed governor of the equatorial provinces of Sudan, he found a trade that was still active but deeply weakened compared to its former power. The routes that had once carried tens of thousands of captives per year now moved a fraction of that number. The compounds that had once held hundreds of people were diminished, fortified with expensive precautions against the kind of attacks that had become legend. Gordon's subsequent campaign against the slave trade, one of the few genuinely humanitarian efforts of the colonial period, was aided immeasurably by knowledge that he obtained from local informants, knowledge that could be traced back through generations of oral transmission to the man who had first mapped the systems of oppression in such meticulous detail. The walking map was never forgotten. In the villages along the old caravan routes, his story was told and retold, elaborated with each generation, transformed from history into mythology. He became a figure like the trickster gods of West African tradition, a being of supernatural cunning who had used his intelligence to defeat enemies many times his power. Children were named after him. Songs were composed about his exploits. Shrines appeared at locations associated with his legend, places where escaped captives claimed to have received guidance, where the spirit of resistance was said to dwell. Some scholars have argued that the historical Kofi was a composite figure, that the exploits attributed to him were actually the work of many different individuals who have been collapsed into a single heroic narrative. Others insist that the documentary evidence, fragmentary as it is, points to a real person with real accomplishments, even if the details have been embroidered by generations of storytelling. The truth perhaps lies somewhere between these positions. There was a man. There were events. But what that man became in the memory of those who came after, the symbol he represented, the hope he embodied, transcended any individual life. This is the nature of heroism in the face of oppression. Those who resist become larger than themselves. Their actions acquire meaning beyond their immediate effects. They become stories that other people tell, examples that other people follow, proof that resistance is possible even when it seems futile. The walking map, whoever he was, whatever became of him, achieved something that outlasted his life by generations. He demonstrated that the systems of cruelty are not inevitable, that they can be challenged, that they can be defeated. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to matter, enough to save some lives, enough to light fires that cannot be entirely extinguished. In the villages that dot the modern Darfur region, children still play a game called the walking map. The rules are simple. One child is blindfolded and must navigate a course set by the others, using only verbal directions and their memory of the terrain. The child who completes the course most accurately wins. The game is ancient. far older than the events of 1839, but its name changed sometime in the mid-19th century, taking on new significance, connecting a simple children's pastime to a legend of resistance and cunning. Anthropologists who have studied the region note that the game serves multiple functions. It teaches children to pay attention to their environment, to develop spatial memory, to learn the landscape that will be essential to their survival as they grow older. But it also passes down a message about the power of knowledge, about the possibility that even the most powerless person can become dangerous if they pay attention, if they remember, if they wait for the right moment to act. This is perhaps Kofi's greatest legacy, greater even than the compounds he burned or the people he freed, or the chaos he sowed in the machinery of the slave trade. He left behind a way of thinking, a strategic approach to resistance, a demonstration that intelligence can overcome force when properly applied. The methods he developed were adapted by later generations facing different forms of oppression. During the modest uprising of the 1880s, rebels used techniques that scholars have traced back to the walking map's playbook: detailed knowledge of terrain, disruption of supply lines, psychological warfare designed to undermine the enemy's confidence. During the long struggles against colonial rule in the 20th century, resistance movements throughout the Sahel drew on traditions of cunning and patience that connected to the legend of the man who had turned the slavers' roads against them. The fire that burned Ibrahim al-Rashid's compound in the summer of 1839 has never entirely gone out. It smolders in the stories that are still told, in the games that children still play, in the knowledge that passes from generation to generation about how to survive, how to resist, how to wait for the moment when knowledge becomes power. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our history forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so that I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Kofi Mensah's story touched your heart. Share so that the memory of the walking map will never be forgotten. The desert keeps its secrets close. But tonight, we pried one loose. And in doing so, we joined a tradition of remembrance that stretches back through generations, connecting us to all those who refuse to let the stories of resistance disappear into the sand. Until next time, keep watching, keep remembering, keep telling the stories that others would rather forget.